I'm Oliver. In 2015, I started a company called Placecraft Design Build. We are a company that focuses on ecological and natural building. And at current, we're 9 folks. We started, it was just my brother and I up on the top left. And over the years, we've grown. And I want to say a big thank you. Some of these folks here are here today, mostly Brad over there, and I really wouldn't be sitting here without all of their dedication and hard work over the years, and it's really exciting to be growing and to have such a wonderful group of talented folks that I get to work alongside every day. Big thanks there. A little bit of a roadmap for tonight. Let's say it's 5 chapters. I've got, first up is a need for new stories. I'm going to highlight that. People and place. And then we get into nature-oriented dwelling and what that means to us. Some of the innovations that we're working on that have to do with nature-oriented dwelling. And finally, carbon. I wanted to start with the two, before I got into building, I was a photographer and a filmmaker, and so I wanted to start there, because a lot of the ideas that were swirling around my head that I'm using now in our company came to me through working in that medium. And so I was going to start by sharing a few projects that I worked on over the years. And the first one introduces a need for new stories. Can anybody tell me where that is?
Everywhere.
How about these? Does it look familiar? Looks familiar and also not at all, right? Any guesses?
New Mexico.
Mexico. How about this one? New England. How about this is a toughie one. That's close. Chicago. Good. How could you tell? You guessed. And this one. Mexico. For the last ones that were up there, what gave it away?
The roof, yeah.
Roofs?
The
Mountain?
Yeah.
Any material? Flora? Yeah, I think, materials speak to us about what the place is. Materials that are on the buildings and what the buildings are made of are an indicator of where you are, and they get you connected to the place right away because you can see them. Those are the things that are being used to construct that building. And so it's a recognition of space. When I was growing up, did anybody else grow up in a rapidly expanding suburb, by the way? Where did you grow up?
Vancouver, Washington.
Okay. Anybody else?
San Diego area.
Yeah.
Southern California.
Any other rapidly expanding suburb? Where's that?
Grew up not far from Levittown.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I did. I grew up in the western suburbs in the Tualatin Valley in Hillsborough. And, part of what was formative in my life as I look back was that I saw a lot of my favorite fields, I saw the forests just kind of go away. And what they were being replaced with was largely this kind of thing. It was basically just, what ticky-tacky legacy. People familiar with ticky-tacky? Yeah, that song, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes of... Yep, that's the one. So I came up with a photo series that was basically a ticky-tacky legacy. So if that's the materials that we're choosing to hand down and pass down through generations, we're basically handing down this legacy of ticky-tacky, this legacy of cheap, fast, and my sense was that this was largely what we were using to kind of tell the story about who we are and our relationship to the natural world. Can everybody read this? It says, wetland, please retain in natural state. And there's a fence there that's kind of keeping us separate from that. And you can kind of see in the background that's, you know, what's going on there is the houses. So part of what I was noticing after I left for college and I came back and I started kind of ruminating on these ideas was just I wanted to kind of unpack that and kind of think about our relationship to place, and what I was starting to understand was that there was just kind of this obliviousness to the natural world, and that was showing up in most of the structures that we were there, that we saw. Here's another one. You've seen kind of the wetland that's kind of basically a code stormwater thing, and it's always fenced off. The water in the communities are always fenced off. And I came to the realization, or I came to kind of think about that the choice of materials matter. The choices, the materials that we put into our buildings, it really matters. It not only gives us a sense of the place where we are, but it's all, you know, it's what we're handing down and giving to our, you know, to our family and to our kids. And you know, designing some of those images that we saw earlier, it's about designing a structure to work with the climate that it's a part of, and it's designing and organizing space in relationship to the natural world. And all of these things together inform our collective understanding about place and where we are in the natural world and how we fit in with it. So through film and photography, my work has long been geared towards exploring the intersections of nature, natural world, and our built environments, and how people interact with the place that they live in. Some years later, I found myself in North Carolina, and I put together a little documentary project. This is the first year that I was a builder, and I was really drawn to, let me see. This project, on one of my days off as a builder, this project had me getting on my bicycle, and I would ride around the county, Alamance County in North Carolina. And what I was wanting to do was just kind of observe and interact and see how people were interacting in the built environment. And for me, it was just a meditative experience to kind of just observe and bear witness to what was happening in the community that I was living in. And so I'd hop on my bike and I would ride around, and if there was somebody out in their yard gardening, or you know, maybe it was a father and son tending to their bees, or a lot of times it was farmers out in the field working, and other times you know, I would just stop and take a picture of an old barn and photograph it. And I was creating this series and this collection and kind of this, what I like to call is like an almanac. I did it for a year over the time that we lived there. And I was just collecting stories and meditating on that question of people and place. And one day, I came along, and I saw this man. You can see him up on his brick porch there. And he was just sitting out there, and I got up the nerve to kind of flag him down and said, hey, I'm just riding around. I live down the road, and I'm interested in documenting my community and seeing what stories are here. And that's about all I ever really said. And a lot of times people were, almost everybody was just completely hospitable and said, sure, great, set up your camera, whatever. And as I was sitting there and talking to him, and I was setting up my camera, and I barely kind of got it set up like that, and he looked around to me, and I wasn't interviewing them, I was just observing and, you know, documenting and he just kind of out of the blue said, I really don't like logging or cutting trees down, you know. I feel bad about it because every time I cut a tree down, it's a breath of fresh air I'm losing. You know what I mean? But you know, still, you got to do what you got to do, I reckon. And not a breath really left before he said, and you know, my doctor, he says, I got a bad heart. I'm not getting oxygen to it. The blood vessels are constricting. And for me at the time, I was just kind of struck that he opened that up to me, as a stranger on his porch. I'd never met him before, and that's what was on his mind. He was sitting out there. He later reflected on how he just really enjoyed the peacefulness of the location. But for him to be sitting there and to just open up to me about his work, that was on his mind. And it was something that he wanted to share with someone. He shared it with a stranger. It wasn't long after that I came across this scene, and I'm going to play a video from the film series, and I'd just like to let us soak it in a little bit. Whoops. Tech stuff. You get some semblance of what this place sounds like. The machines aren't running. So I compiled part of this project was for me to kind of bear witness to what was happening in my community and to see what was, where materials were coming from, what are we doing, and what is our relationship with the landscape. As I came to find out, there was a new law that passed in that community that basically it gave farmers a tax write-off if they could selectively harvest about half of any wood lot that they had. And so it seemed to be kind of a buzz as I was moving around the community that that's really what people were doing, is they were just taking advantage of this, and there was kind of a cash rush to get all of this done. One other vignette I happened upon when I was preparing this, and I didn't even notice it at the time, but I heard in the background they said, well, what if, if there are even any left? And the other fellow said, what? And he said, forests. It's like, yeah, it's just amazing. What gets me is the trucks are going both ways. And so this guy is observing what's happening around him, and he's and this whole community is kind of feeling this happening to them. I think it's just a palpable thing that's happening. And I thought back to that gentleman on the porch that's talking about he cuts down a tree, and we saw that. To me, I can't understand how you could perform in that environment and not feel sick. And so, to me, materials, they speak to the place that we are in, but when we choose materials, it makes choices about the work that people get subjected to, the work that they get to do, and that work gives people purpose. And so that is for me, as someone that was, deciding what I'd like to get off and do in my life, it was really instrumental in trying to understand how to navigate that. It's just, for these folks in that community, it just didn't feel right. In fact, for this gentleman, it seems like his very livelihood was something that was killing him. And there's a fair amount of externalized costs that happen. So clearly they do this, the two slides that I showed together are going hand in hand. Cheap, fast. This is how we're doing this right now. And when you're, I developed in my film, I started to really find ways to point my camera in things that gave me hope. I found things in this community that gave me hope, and you start to look, you get cynical, and you say, okay, I understand what I don't like, but what is it? What's out there that I do like? And how do I help create that? How do I help build that? How do I pour all my energy into finding the thing that's beautiful about this world and putting that into the community? And so it was my first year working as a carpenter full time, and there's one more story from working in North Carolina that I'd like to share. The fellow I worked for, Logan Parker, with Heirloom Builders, was a natural builder, strawbale, and it was some of my early experiences with that. But what really got me going at the time was that he had a sawmill. And that was so cool because we could take local lumber, we could take local trees. Oftentimes a farmer had a storm fall or something, we'd grab it, we'd mill it up, we'd set it aside. And then I didn't stay long enough with him to make any cabinets with it, but the projects from the years before, we got to make these beautiful cabinets with them and all this thing, and that to me really started to speak to me. This is how we connect to our landscape. A farmer came around to Logan, and they knew that he had a sawmill and that was a gifted carpenter, and he said, a big oak tree came down and crushed my cabin. My granddaddy built that cabin, and I don't know what to do with it, but I'd like to pass it on somehow. And they came up with an idea like, well, look at these beautiful old hand-hewn red oak timbers. Let's do something with that. What would suit your... He says, well, I like the idea of a table. We can gather about it, we can capture that, we can tell stories around it, and we can remember the granddaddy built that cabin back in 1815, and we can tell stories about that. And so we milled it up, we put together a cabinet or a table, and we delivered it to him. And that sort of spoke to me, to say the least, in the connection that grandfather was making between the land, the materials, and how he wanted to pass that on, how he wanted to create a legacy for his grandkids. And that really influenced how I came to think about things. That later summer, my neighbors, turns out, are starting a natural building school. This is Greg and Mike, and they put together this. And so I'd like to share this. I traded some of my film skills to take a 10-day immersive in natural building. And I'll play some of this. I'll narrate a little bit since this is a natural building talk after all. So we're making cob. The thing is, don't touch anything. That's Mike, Donna. He's got a great company, Rising Earth Natural Building. He's mostly up in upstate New York. And the other guy with the beard is Greg, who started the Mudbugger School of Natural Building in Central North Carolina. This workshop that I did was an immersive experience in cob, strawbale, plaster, straw clay, and that was it. So we made straw clay, we stuck it on the wall, and we're doing a hand plaster. This is plastering over straw bale. It's a beautiful location, basically next door to all the logging operation there. They've crafted this 10-acre parcel there, and every year they keep building new beautiful structures on it. It's really become a mecca, I think, for natural building workshops, and they really do a nice job. So at the end of every day, of course, they have meals, and we camped there, a beautiful space to lay out a tent, and meals throughout, and a campfire, and we all gathered and got to share stories around the campfire at the end of that. And I think I was starting to find, okay, this seems like an antidote to what I grew up in, from what I witnessed, and this is something I can pour my heart into, and this is something that I can really get into. And at the time, I didn't have the language, but I could tell that the old ones was basically a nature oblivious. And I started to understand that this way of building, this natural building, for instance, was a nature-oriented approach to building. So, jumping ahead in my chronology, let's see how we do this. So, yeah, the main thing here that we're talking about is what is a nature-oriented dwelling. So, just a little bit about this phrase. Dwelling, of course, is a noun. It's a shelter. It's also a verb. It means to live in a place, in a specific place. So, if you're dwelling in a nature-oriented way, what does that look like? And then it's also to linger over, emphasize, or ponder. And I would say that's described a lot of what my life has been like, is dwelling in nature-oriented ways, trying to think about what all that means. And it's trying to identify that intersection between nature, built environments, and to find that sense of place that we all can recognize in the structures that we build. Would anybody like to share what a nature-oriented dwelling might, in that conception, what comes to mind when thinking about nature-oriented dwelling? Yurt.
Just using natural materials to build a thing.
Yeah.
Work in harmony with nature.
Work in harmony.
Permaculture.
Permaculture.
Smaller footprint and smaller impact.
Mm-hmm.
Reminds me of building a treehouse as a kid.
Uh-huh. Did you have Home Depot deliver all the materials for that, or did you?
No, unfortunately not. We had this stuff, what we had right around us.
Ah, I like that.
Shed.
Just had what was right around there. That sounds good.
Having attention to like where the dwelling is placed in relation to like a river or sunlight or shade.
Yeah.
Smaller dwelling, but more nature-led.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think of nature like centered, so like trying to reflect nature and the building so that it is still part of nature and not separate from it.
Yeah, I love all that. As I moved back from North Carolina and moved back home here to Portland area, I was in love with natural building. I wanted to do all of it, and some of the things that you just mentioned here, and I'll add to the list. What is natural building? Soul. It's got this soul feel. When you're in the space, you can feel like you're connected to it. It's non-toxic, of course, using natural materials. It encourages a rural and urban connection, which I think is a really important thing, especially in these times. And the waste that it generates from it is compostable, better occupant health. Anybody heard of vernacular architecture? What is that?
Isn't it? I believe it's using earth. Like I've heard about it in reference to cob, building with clay, sand, and straw.
Yeah. Mark?
Well, conventionally, it means that there's a kind of a regional way of doing things, and people usually discuss it as like that it represents more of an aesthetic or a style. But I think it's deeper.
Yeah.
Utility is that there's a way of thinking and adapting the place, the conditions, and the things that you do in that place that people kind of share and you see all around you.
Right. Yeah, and I think I love it. I came across that idea, and it basically speaks to those buildings that people could identify. That was being built in the vernacular, and largely that was the only way that people built, of course, before industrialized things. You just built with what was close at hand, and you built with those materials. Other things that of course are beautiful and special about natural building is that it can be sculpted and handcrafted. And of course, the connection to the natural world. So, why isn't everybody doing it? It seems pretty good. Any guesses? Any ideas on why all of our homes aren't built that way?
Bureaucracy, regulations.
It's not easy.
It's not easy. Let's,
Time-consuming.
Labor
Labor
of
intensive.
love.
Yeah.
Can't replicate it.
Yeah. I think when we first started Placecraft, and we dabbled and we really started to do natural building. But yeah, there were friction points. It seemed like even working with clients, people wanted it, but it's like, oh, it sounds kind of more expensive, or I don't have the time to invest right now to do a big work party to offset some of those labor costs. Something that I started to think about when, and I had a background in theater, so this was kind of a relevant thing. But did anybody study improv or know do improv theater? Does anybody know the kind of the main first rule of improv?
Yes.
What is it?
Yes.
Yes, and. I love that, and I was a little bit too shy when I was a kid, and when I was studying theater, and I regret that, because the lessons of the yes and were huge, and I've been really trying to incorporate them in the business model. So the idea with natural building is that I have this idea and I want the world to accept it, right? Well, the world is already kind of doing this thing. It's already going about in this sort of improvisational way. So for me to jump in and say, no, I want to do it this way, it kind of ruins the whole play. And I started to think, okay, yes, I see what you're doing, and let's start to do this. And so for us as Placecraft, we try to just fold the things in that had the least amount of friction points. And of course, the biggest competitor or whatever, competing idea, is all that stuff that we saw at the beginning. There's ticky-tacky, it's cheap, it's fast, it's easy to throw up, it's hard. It's like, well, okay, but what are some of the things that are in conventional building that we can tap into and we can use? And if we use some of these, maybe we can start to slide the natural building into well, nobody's noticing. Is there anything, anybody want to say anything about conventional that you think might, be a draw for someone other than, as compared to natural building?
Well, I'm interested in part of the natural buildings that caught up is how do they stand up in earthquakes?
Uh-huh. So seismic, there's engineering that's figured out and all that, yeah. Cleanliness? Ah, okay.
If you're going to use traditional materials, things are sort of standardized.
Standardization.
Which is not necessarily a good thing, but
yeah.
And if you need to find general labor, pretty much everyone understands how to put 2x4s together.
Aha. There's a work pool that already kind of knows how to do the thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's definitely an obstacle in natural building. There's not a lot of people that are plaster, that are master at plasters. So let's start to take some of the things that are going to grease the wheels and get our little natural building slipped into the conventional world. So a few things that we called out and we're starting to use in thinking about that. Building science, which we can touch on a little bit more. There's existing workforce. Advanced framing is a great thing. There's reliable supply lines, at least there were. It jives with the existing housing stock, which I think is important for folks. People see that Cobb building and they say, great, but I don't want that to go next to that Craftsman. How can I blend in with the neighborhood? Unions and trade programs are represented in conventional that I think natural builders can use, and let's start to build those. And then prefab and modular systems are really interesting. How can we expedite some of these processes of natural building? How can we get the main parts of natural building into some of the prefab developments? And then just the repeatable and controllable processes. And I mentioned there was 3 kind of metrics that we have here. The other one that we're working with is appropriate technology. Is anybody familiar with that term? Somebody want to have a definition for me on that one?
Just enough.
Just enough. Yeah.
Technology that's available in the community.
Right. It's there. User operability. Yeah. Repairability. So you don't need to send it off across the country to have it fixed because there's only one person in the world that knows how to do that. Yeah, and to me, what it speaks to is resiliency is a big part, because you have everything you need right there. You don't have to seek out a specialist. So for us, as we're developing kind of how we want to approach the nature-oriented dwelling, this is such a big part. And I do think we're in a time of transition. And I think resiliency is something that we have to be building into all of our models going forward. So there's a lot of things that are in natural building that I think people associate with natural building, but are really just kind of about appropriate technology. A lot of that has to do with the the manual. We're using people in the labor instead of big, complex, and gas-guzzling machines. That's a big part of it. So yes, it takes a lot more people, but the trade-off with that is that you get this community together, and you have these barn-raising events that help to foster and build resiliency in your community. And you scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours, kind of thing. There's the resiliency we mentioned. It's in here that we start to develop meaningful jobs. I think back on the gentlemen that were working there with those big, giant machines that were just completely out of proportion to what they were doing, and that guy's hurting inside. His job is hurting him, and we need to, when we think about our building models, we need to think about the people that are on the other end of that. Local production, people for, not products. So perfection isn't what we're after here. It's not a product that we're trying to create. We're trying to empower people to be involved in the process, not just some commodification that we go and buy somewhere. The big one for me here, one of the big ones, is the waste transparency. There's a lot of externalizing waste that happens in our society. Yeah, we don't see that river's getting polluted over there to create our electronics. We don't see that. We're right here. Our river's, okay. But if you have to deal with the waste that you're generating in your community, you start to not make that waste anymore. It's important. It's important whenever you're creating any sort of model or how you want to build a house. The human scale thing we've talked about, decentralized. I like this because and we can touch on this a little bit more, but part of what we're doing is we have systems that can be modified for a local community, maybe on the other side of the Cascades or down in Santa Fe. They're going to make it their own, and they're going to make it for what they need. And then it's the stories, it's the communal work, it's the connecting with people, it's the purpose and the legacy that you're building with community. And of course, the low carbon production. So these are kind of the three. This is kind of our Venn diagram, and how we're starting to think about how we'd like to build and really introduce natural building into the world. We're trying to keep the things that are resonant and are important about all of these aspects, and to try to create a viable business model, really, that if it works out, that others will follow, and we can help others in that journey too. So I'd like to outline some of the innovations that we've been working to kind of fit all this together. I'd like to pause if there's any questions or any comments so far. You just roll right into it. So the first one that we've got, I've actually got some on display here, is the Strockler Block. So people are familiar with what's generally known as light straw clay. So you're taking straw. This is different from strawbale. You're taking straw, you're breaking it up, it's loose, you're coating it with clay slip, and then you're packing it into a form, and then you release the forms, and then you have a wall. So that's actually my background, and that's how, when I first started getting into natural building, I gravitated towards that because I saw it as being the closest to conventional and the best path forward to getting the important straw-based wall system, but yet not deviating too far from conventional. And of course, I'll mention Robert Laporte with EcoNest is who I worked with, and is another mentor of mine. So it's a centuries-old technique. People have been doing this for a long time. But as we started to do it in this region in particular, there's a couple of friction points that we wanted to address. We love a site packed. Generally, what you're doing is you're making the material and you're packing it directly into the thing, and you're forming up your walls, and then you're stripping it, and you're done. You're walking away. It's been packed. The challenge with that is that in this climate, we only have about, we have almost no window in order to achieve this properly with enough time for it to cure before the fall comes in. So if you've got a light straw bay project right now, generally you kind of have to get the straw in the walls now, meaning June. And then you might have a chance of getting it dry so anyway, that was a friction point. And then the other one was just as we were moving and building in the urban environment, the apparatus that you need to bring with you is huge. And then you've got the clay thing, and you've got all the straw bale. It was hard, and we wanted to build small little structures in people's backyards. It was challenging. So to try to make it more accessible for an urban environment, we've come up with the Strockler Block, so straw clay block. What we found is that it's creating less redundant labor. We've got predictable install times, meaning we can frame up just like any conventional building, and instead of bringing in the hemp bats or your rock wool or whatever, you just bring in the Strockler blocks and you install it. They're dried off-site, out of the production flow of the thing, so it's creating more efficiency in that way and allowing construction projects to stay on schedule. We use conventional, albeit advanced framing, so there's reduced amount of lumber in the walls and adds to the efficiency there. And we're maintaining the community involvement through the block party, which I'll get to in a moment. So here's Tarn installing some Strockler blocks at the project we did out in Mesquite. This is a bunch of blocks that are loaded up on our trailer and ready to head over to this sauna project, which is in southeast Portland. That's Matt there in the picture. Matt and Tucker did a fantastic job framing this all up and getting this basically where it is now. So this is our most recent project. It's getting plastered tomorrow, starting plaster tomorrow. Very exciting. So what do all these things have in common? We've got 4 different styles of structure, different claddings. Guess what? It's Strockler blocks. So yeah, basically you can put the blocks in, and then however you want to finish it, be it plaster or wood siding or wood cladding, the choice is yours. I will point out this structure here. This is we helped Sweet Home Teacup, who they had planned on doing a light straw clay project. We made all the blocks in our factory, our blockery. We put them all, we dried them in our blockery, and then we brought them on over and installed them, and it was just so fast. I think we had 5 people in the morning, and it was just it just goes so fast. Anyway, I wanted to highlight that in particular because BVC's hosting and Sweet Home's hosting a plaster party at the end of this week at that very structure. Very beautiful cob / Strockler block / straw clay / awesome everything. So yeah, lots of different claddings to choose from, and different configurations there.
Got a question over here.
Yes.
Well, I'm just wondering if you're going to talk about different approaches, if you could talk about how adaptable or how well they're suited for the Pacific Northwest.
Uh-huh.
And in particular, I'm interested in the insulating qualities,
Sure.
or if you need extra insulation, and also mildew or rot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mildew and mold. It happens. It happens in this climate on any material. So it's all about the detailing. When you have a conditioned space that lasts through a winter without being conditioned, no matter what you've got in that wall, in the walls, it's likely to get mold. So it's important to keep that in mind. What we found when we're making these blocks in particular, and I'm glad you asked the mold thing, because it's something that we worked through this winter. So we're trying to make these blocks, and we're trying to find the curability of these blocks. When what we've discovered is there's kind of this critical drying time that once they're out of the formwork, you've got to get them into a dry condition within about a week or so. Otherwise, it's potential, and that happens with the site stuff too. If it's just too moist and too humid, So yeah, it's important to kind of get them over that hurdle, and then they cure the rest of the way. Once they're cured, what we found is they're just as stable, like these guys, they're just as stable as anything else, you know. If they got rehydrated, there could be potential for mold growth, for instance. R value question, the blocks themselves are 10 and a half, are 10 and a half. On the smaller structures, that's more than enough. As we go into permitting, we are adding various different things depending on the claddings and stuff like that. But yeah, in order to get over into the R value, we're adding generally a wood fiber board, kind of is analogous to that system. Yeah. Did I answer all of those? Thank you. Yeah.
Just briefly, what's the difference between drying and curing?
Yeah, it's kind of an in-house thing, and I think I kind of made it up. But for us, it's kind of drying. It means it's basically the surface dried. Anything that can interact with the air is kind of dry. But there's this curing process, and the rule of thumb with straw clay, if it's being dried passively, is you get about 1 inch of dry per week, 1/2 inch from each side. So once we make these blocks, if we're not doing anything else to dry them, they're about 6 weeks to be fully cured. And what that means is below 20% moisture content.
And is that even in winter in this open?
No,
area
and that's what we
space?
discovered. So we didn't have any block. We sold that sauna project, and we didn't have any blocks made in the optimal time. And so we tried to make them, and it just didn't cure fast enough, and it was tough. So we finally made these were part of the batch we made for the sauna, and I think we finally felt good about it in April, and we made them, and they dried naturally, you know, without any other thing, and we were able to install them about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it took about that 6 weeks.
Did you cut them?
Yeah, they cut them. So we've got this 3-wheel bandsaw, which is pretty cool, which allows us to pass the whole block through. We also, for Sweet Home's project, she didn't want any power tools on the site, so we just bandsaw them, and they go quite good.
It just doesn't turn for it.
Yeah. So the blockery, this is our community hub. This is where we host our block parties, and what we're really seeing is this being the hub for the community block parties, but also a place for education and innovation. Sweet Home, again, in the block parties we did last year, she does a guided qigong and breath and movement to help us kind of get grounded in the space that we are in, and that's been a really nice thing. And we'll be having some block parties later this year.
Is the blockery, it looks like it's near the St. John's Bridge.
Yeah, it is. So is anybody familiar with Green Anchors? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a facility, it's about 6 acres, and the guys that run it are great guys, eco warrior types, and what they've done is they've taken this brownfield, 6 acres of brownfield, and they've given really affordable rates to people that have these kind of, it's like an incubator space and it's been great to be there. We expanded, and they were really flexible to put this whole thing together, and we're definitely outgrowing the space. Lots of artists and other builders and makers and stuff down there.
Can you go and visit there?
Yeah, you can stop on by and come say hello.
Does
One of
it
the
dry faster in the sun or?
yeah, wind is the big thing. So we've noticed. Wind is a big airflow. However you want to dry it, make sure there's airflow. Is the big part. So one of the things, and kind of touching about the natural building versus the conventional, is that we mentioned the reliable source for materials. So that's one thing that we envision maybe for the future for us, is that we can become a one-stop shop for anything in your natural building. Because every project I ever did, and every project that a lot of my friends have done, they kind of hit the same. They're kind of repeating the same work. They're trying to find all these materials. So we'd like to help support that in a way. And you got a new job, a blocksmith. So what we've established here is kind of this opposite of ticky-tacky, something that allows us to embrace the natural world and that gives us a reverence for the materials that are found there naturally. And it also gives us, it makes us, and it allows us to kind of keep a lookout for the people that are involved in the work at every stage along the process. And that's really important. And so the spaces are imbued with these, with the resources, the abundance from our area, and people get to take part in all of the process. The community can take part in a lot of the processes, and that's kind of a big deal for us. The people being involved and the memories made helps infuse the space with the humanity of it all. And what we're doing is trying to create new legacy. There's my wife. There's my little girl, Juniper, in the node, and that's my nephew, learning to use a drawing knife. So what I want to say is yes, all of that stuff, and there's the carbon stuff. So I would be remiss if I didn't touch on this because it's super important. Does anybody know what carbon is? So I really believe this, and I'm really hopeful about a lot of this. And I'll just read this. The developed world's dependence on fossil fuels to build our homes is just a blip in time and is quickly expiring. Forward-thinking builders around the globe are transitioning to plant-based, carbon-sequestering construction, and homeowners are falling in love with the healthy, affordable, earth-friendly alternatives. There are so many people that are hip to what was going on. We're doing this thing. There's a lot of other people out there doing hemp, doing mass timber, all sorts of things going on. It's a movement that we're a part of. So why is it important to sequester carbon? If we don't. Yeah. So how do we decarbonize our buildings? Just a little bit here. A lot of focus has, up until recently, a lot of focus has been on the operational carbon, which operational carbon is basically the carbon that's expended and gets released in the atmosphere in order to operate the thing, so mostly heating and cooling. The strategies that people have been employing have been to, and rightfully so, maximize the R value in the home, make them more efficient. That means you need less heat, less cooling, and then tighter envelopes, which, by the way, is more important as I gather than the R value. And then the electrification. Let's get rid of the fossil fuels burning in our homes, the natural gas. Let's use alternative fuel systems. Alternative renewable resources. So people are familiar with LEED certified passive house. That's kind of been the focus with a lot of that. The problem with that is that it doesn't get after what we call the embodied carbon. What's the embodied carbon? Yeah. It's basically everything that goes into the product before it becomes a house and how it got to be in that product, state. So in this instance, the means that we're trying to get do not justify the end, because the end is nullified by the means over there. It's changing too, as a lot of things are, but a lot of the ways that you got to this net zero or whatever certification was a heavy use of petroleum products, primarily foam and also concretes and all sorts of other things. So there's a huge carbon footprint on just getting to the operational carbon. We'll get on why that's a big deal. On the other hand, natural building, if you're using plants, straw, hemp, that kind of thing, it actually stores the carbon. So of course, straw and other living things build carbon. They use the carbon to build their bodies, and then at the end of their life, when they're being harvested, a lot of times the good parts plucked, say the grain or whatever, and then their bodies are burned or the bodies are left to rot in the ground. Both of those things release the carbon. And so if you take that waste product and you put it into your building or anything else, that's what means to sequester that carbon. So the plants actually store the carbon. Besides that, the natural building produces minimal transportation, minimal processing, fewer materials generally. And then down here in appropriate technology, that you're using simple machines, you're using passive systems that aren't reliant on fossil fuels, because that generally isn't found locally. And by the way, if you're using mass is potential in some climates to capture and store energy with the mass, which is going to reduce your operational carbon. And then you have, say it's an appropriate technology thing, a smaller building footprint, which definitely lowers your operational carbon. So most of the movement now, people are talking about how do we sequester carbon into our buildings. Even the passive house and all that, they're wise to it. So I'm optimistic and hopeful about all that. And this is the chart that I think kind of explains all that best. Conventional, you harvest, you're at a zero point, you harvest and you're putting all this petroleum, you're burning all this thing, you're putting all this carbon in the atmosphere, not only carbon, but all sorts of toxins and all that kind of stuff. Okay, now you're at the zero. So you're like, okay, cool, I'm zero now, and I can just live my life at zero. But let's just ignore all of that. Okay. So over here, what we do is we have a little bit of petroleum being used, and then we harvest it, and we put it in we start to make product to put it into our building, and then we build it. Now we're down here with that zero. And then even at the end, most of these products can be reused or recycled or become biochar, all of which are options to keep well below. So the building itself is actually helping to solve climate change. And why is that important if we're thinking about things in a timeline? Because we don't have a lot of time. And so we need to draw it down now.
Wait, in the graph on the right side,
Yeah.
up above the middle line, middle land, along that middle.
Oh, this one?
Where it says land on the green.
Oh, yeah.
Green bit,
Yeah.
landfill and methane.
Yeah, so if I took this right here and I threw it in my backyard, in a couple of years or whatever, it would go away. It would kind of decompose.
Right.
And that is also a release of carbon. I could burn it and it would be much faster, but yeah, it also releases carbon. So that's why it's important when you're harvesting the straw. A lot of times you just let it decompose or whatever, or you burn it. So decomposition, it takes a little bit more time, but it also releases the methane and the carbon. Yeah.
Well, I learned a couple of years ago that the Green New Deal is incorporating this.
Yes.
And we should be very frustrated and angry that we never really get to talk about what it consists of. It's just this flashpoint, this trigger point of opposition and disinformation and distortion, but it's actually based on a practical approach to sequestering carbon. I mean, this is just one of its dimensions of vast spectrum of practical initiatives. So it's based.
Yeah. Yeah. So the point is we need to change that story too. It's another story that needs to be rewritten there. A couple ideas that we kind of have on the back burner, and I'd love to get input and support and thoughts on. But how do we get credits for carbon storage in the energy code? So there's a question about R value. Yeah, it's true. The things that grown in your backyard isn't as good as what you can, create with petroleum. It's true, but it also stores all this carbon. So if the goal with the energy code is to reduce our greenhouse gases or to reduce our footprint generally, then we need to be giving credits for people that are choosing to build this way. And then, a proportional energy code based on square footage, because right now, at least to my understanding, if I built a 600 square foot home or a 2,500 square foot home, I'm held to the same standard. And it's clear that the operational carbon footprint of that is much lower. So how can we create a proportional energy code so I'm not kind of restricted in some of what we want to do? That's one area to kind of, maybe we can kind of coast through and get through some of the bureaucracy there. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Chris Magwood in all this, but Chris Magwood is I think basically the author of that. His whole thesis was based on that, and that's only a 4 or 5 years old thesis. So a lot of this is really fresh. And speaking of super fresh, is this thing that Chris Magwood and a few other heavy hitters in the natural building world have put together, which is the BEAM calculator, which is building emissions accounting for materials. So This is the structure we have on the deck coming up. We just did this yesterday, and we're still kind of working through it, but I thought it was interesting to kind of see how they're putting this metric together. It's a super awesome tool. It's really exciting. You can see, you know, the big things that are problematic about ours, the foundation walls, which we might have some options to do, and then our roof. We're using a metal roof, so that, you know, that's got a high embodied carbon input. It also lasts a long time, but that, you know, that, so, you know, if we switch to say a living roof or shingles or something, we could really lower that. So fascinating. In other words, you know, wondering what the footprint is of your house. Well, now there's an app for that. But I want to say, yes, science, and I love all that, and it's so important. And we're gonna, you know, we're definitely going to be able to tech our way into a lot of great solutions. There's no question that we're going to have carbon panels, and we're going to be doing all sorts of stuff. It's already happening. But it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible that we can have all those solutions and lose touch of all those other things that I brought up in the beginning. And that's what I want to close on today, is that in spite of all the tech and everything that we'd be able to do, it's really important that we don't lose touch with our humanity in the process, and lose touch with the stories that we're trying to tell one another with the spaces that we create.